Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. Just a mere 48 hours following the 2024 presidential election here in the United States, we might say that the veritable scepter of Western hegemony has fallen back into the hands of one of the world's most notable and self-professed advocates of unsolicited sexual advances, to say the least, former game show host Donald J. Trump. And given Trump's penchant for symbolic flair, unabashed duplicity, and utter enjoyment of spectacle, we are happy to have had the cosmic accident of scheduling today's episode and its theme, having forgotten that it was to coincide with election week. But we welcome this moment of serendipity as a chance not only to reaffirm our commitment to anti-fascism, anti-imperialism, and all of the other antis that go along with it, but it invites an overdue cigarette break with a figure who actually does some real numbers in the podcast algorithm, Monsieur Jean Baudrillard. But more importantly, we have with us a guest who has been a longtime supporter of the podcast and someone who is also active in the para-academic philosophy space, Cameron Carsten. And we on the podcast are making good on a promise we made to ourselves by reaching out to others in the online community who we think are doing good work, like Cameron, and getting them on the show. And today, we will be looking at a blog post from Cameron's blog, which will be linked in the show notes, entitled, "Are We Still Able to Die?" which explores how power is not merely a force for domination, but a force which reconfigures the very ground of the symbolic order and influences how we experience reality itself. This leads to unsettling questions about the role of hegemony, how it can undermine the symbolic value of life and death, absorbing even acts of resistance into its own machinery. Alongside Cameron's insights, we'll also be reflecting on Jean Baudrillard's The Agony of Power, published by Semiotext in 2010, a collection of some of Beau's final and most incisive work. And before I introduce this episode and Cameron, I want to remind everyone who's listening right now that we are continuing our campaign to produce a very anti-fascist and aesthetically rich combination of a tarot deck and compendium of philosophical essays entitled Acéphalous, the Erotic Tarot of George Bataille. So many people have supported our Kickstarter and the campaign is trucking along, but the way that this works is ultimately, if we want this to be produced, we need your support. So go ahead and navigate to the show notes and maybe support the campaign while you're listening here today. And maybe just to make one final appeal, this is a way for us, Acid Horizon, to do something that isn't bound by the dictates of a publishing company. And it produces something that is unique and will be a limited run. So if you want to support us in November, this is certainly the way to do it. And there are support tiers to which you can contribute, which will ensure the success of the project. With that said, Cameron, thank you for waiting. I want to thank you for having been supportive of Acid Horizon for so long and taking the time to come on the show today to talk about your work.
Yeah, thank you all for inviting me on. Long-time listener, first-time caller. I guess I don't know exactly what to include in an introduction, but with the blog post overall, to introduce, I guess, the theme of my blog, which I haven't really expressed in the About page, it was kind of a way for me to get my philosophical thoughts, I guess, out there, to give me kind of a drive to do them beyond academia, especially since I'm kind of hopefully in the middle of what is a single gap year. I wanted to be able to continue the work of kind of somewhat investigating post-structuralism and its importance to our kind of day-to-day life, and kind of my thoughts on all the books that I'm reading. Not the most, I guess, radical of intentions, but with this article that we're discussing today, it kind of really got me thinking. I wanted to do kind of this series that kind of power is at its most basic, the ability to kind of reconstruct how somebody understands and interacts with reality, even if it's yourself or somebody else. And a lot of this article discusses kind of stuff that's in line with like Bataille's sovereignty, which I kind of went back to after having written this article. It's like all the stuff on just how domination rules through death and stuff like that. You'll find in like, what is it, Accursed Share 3 early on. But what Baudrillard specifically got me thinking about is kind of these thoughts I've been having ever since I read Anti-Oedipus for the first time a few years back, of power doesn't really exist in the same way it used to. You used to be able to protest the king or even go so far as to basically killing him and his family to take over a country. I mean, to put it as blunt as possible, that would genuinely change how power was constructed at a certain time. But I just keep getting, I guess, I don't know if disillusioned is the right word for it, but kind of angry that power exists in such a way that it almost can't be protested. Thoughts that Fisher expressed, what is it now, 14 years ago? Everyone's showing up to the protests. I think these are very similar answers of Baudrillard's probably a little bit more of a pessimist than Fisher ever was, but the same thoughts I've been having ever since I first got into Fisher or Deleuze. Just a little bit different kind of way of discussing them.
Yeah, and in this particular blog post that you sent to us, I think about theory heads and all the stuff that we just immerse ourselves in, what from the outside looking in look like high-minded concepts. But you ask a question that's at once very basic, but very urgent, which is, given the kind of power structure that we live within, the sort of milieu of late capitalism, if we want to call it that, is it possible for us to render any meaning for our lives or our death? Like this is something that we would encounter in it, like an on death and dying class, or even just like an ethics class or a philosophy 101 class. And so in a way, it's kind of going like back to basics and really getting down to brass tacks. And I mean, let's just start there. What impelled you to ask the question this way? And what do you think makes either Baudrillard a successful or unsuccessful mediator for you in attempting to answer it?
I for that last question, I'm probably going to go both ways, honestly. And part of it is I think I'm a little disappointed in myself on what I actually included in the article, in that I definitely should have talked about how we view Palestine a little bit more. Because I think this is almost a direct parallel to kind of the political metaphysics going on with how we discuss Israel and Palestine. But Baudrillard, having died in 2007, I think it best shows up in how he discusses stuff like 9/11. There's these kind of lives that mean infinitely, and then there's on the other end lives that mean nothing at all, that we're going to have to understand as being put on opposite sides of the spectrum, especially when we get into the, I guess, later chapters of this short work, where he is talking about how the problem with hegemony is that it always pretends that it's the good, or comes in as the way things should be at the very least. I've been trying to figure out how to put it in the correct words over the last few days as I've been preparing for this. But in the way that hegemonic power views death, it's not the same way where domination does, where it controls you through the ability to, I guess, what is the correct wording that Baudrillard uses in Symbolic Exchange and Death? I guess prolong your death or hold off your death. It kind of holds that power over life and death there. And in some way, you can subvert that by literally exiting life. Through martyrdom or something else like that. There's still a symbolic system there that you can protest against by creating a separate outside symbolic system to fight against it. That doesn't really exist anymore. The symbolic system kind of has, or if there still is a quote unquote symbolic system in the same way, hegemony as power kind of constructs it to make martyrdom almost impossible in a way. There is no symbolic possibility for life that really goes against the power structure. It's going to be zero. And no matter how many times you multiply zero, you end up with zero. You can't make a life worth zero kind of be worth something to people who can't see it as something. I mean, to me and to a lot of people, the people bearing the brunt of the horrors of, I guess, global oppression in a way, and the particular ways it exercises itself, these are lives that mean something. It's kind of hard for us to imagine why somebody wouldn't care about these. But to a lot of people, they're just kind of things they don't think about at all. They're things that you can't even make them think about, actually. But when you have events, whether it be 9/11 or other disasters that are kind of these just, I guess, shock moments for Western powers particularly, these lives kind of become infinitely worth. You can perform any action as revenge for these lives, and it will be justified, I guess, through the ways global power wants us to view that reality. Not necessarily the most comfortable conversation to have about life and death, but in the opposite strain as what I was discussing earlier with multiplying zero, you can't divide infinity and get a finite number. You can get an infinite amount of justification, or there's no justification for revenge. Those are kind of the symbolic opportunities that I guess hegemony has left for us, or at least what I wanted to articulate that it has left for us.
Yeah, the first thing that this essay made me think of is, and to Baudrillard's credit, take somebody like Aaron Bushnell, for example. And of course, this is to say nothing of the over 250,000 Palestinian and Lebanese who've been killed by Israel and the United States and Britain and the rest of their Western allies. But the reason I bring up Aaron Bushnell will become apparent in a second. Growing up, in the past 50 years of US history pedagogy in the United States, there's pretty much like a 50-50 chance that you would open towards the end of your history book and see the burning Vietnamese monk. That then became a kind of meme culturally that became embedded within us, whose intent was, at least in the context of a history classroom or in a documentary or something, was to reassert the claim that the Vietnam War was just absolutely horrible. But along comes Aaron Bushnell. When was it? It was, 6 months ago, 8 months ago. I can't even remember. This is part of the Baudrillardian problem. Like, all these events are conflated, chronologically for me. When he took his life, we live in a cultural and technological milieu that just has the absolute panoptic ability to see this event from multiple angles. But when it appeared on the social media timelines, it was like every other bit of ephemera that crosses that flow on any given day. It gets flattened out with all of the other cat videos and posts about people's relationships and so forth. And that's part of the tragedy. And the image of Bushnell's death, just like the image of the deaths of Palestinian and Lebanese killed by Israel in the absence of effective action to stop the genocide, become, sadly, just another node or blip in the daily digital wash that is your social media timeline.
I think one of the most interesting things, and I have a lot of problems with Baudrillard in this text, but one of the most interesting things he does talk about, and I think he's quite underrated to this extent, is Baudrillard is a great thinker of evil. People tend to just think of mostly the Matrix and the communication stuff, but Baudrillard's, much like Bataille, is probably one of the only atheist thinkers of evil that really has any kind of strong purchase in terms of, in a way, he just assumes the fact of evil, but kind of tries to straddle both natural and metaphysical forms of evil. And in one of the things I think, what's interesting in the other part of Baudrillard we read, the chapter 1 of The Agony of Power from Domination to Hegemony, is he says at one point that one of the ways in which power has sort of stripped our ability away to denounce it to some extent, in this move away from straight up personal domination to a more diffuse kind of networked hegemony, is it says, well, only evil can speak of itself now. Now this sounds quite profound, doesn't immediately make any kind of sense, but there's a sense in which also if I say that Trump is doing something evil, it's not going to be taken anywhere near as seriously as when he says the exact same thing for himself. Or when, for example, Netanyahu will make an invocation of the biblical story of Amalek and say that he's going to exterminate everybody in Gaza. And you have Gallant, who now liberal fuckwits are praising as the moderate wing of that fascist entity, is saying, he was the moderate wing when he was saying we're going to exterminate everyone. Now, if I say they're going to exterminate everyone, I get a bunch of opinion columnists jumping down my throat saying I'm a racist. But when you have Gallant or Benjamin Netanyahu or any of these fucking Knesset members or Zionists say whatever they're about to do, that goes by the by anyway because they're saying it. Only evil can therefore speak of evil. When Trump says what he's going to do, it's almost that I'm the stupid one for believing him to that extent. I mean, even we say about, social democratic parties talk about making things worse, and we're told to say, look, this is all part of their electoral strategy. They're not really moving to the right. They're just trying to do this to buy voters off, and then they either fail or they win and they do those things. It seems like only evil is only able to speak of itself, and in that way preempts any attempt at denunciation. And when all we have is denunciation, insofar as we're still, working in the sphere of communicative politics, that sort of Habermasian paradigm, which really is still the state philosophy of a decent chunk of the West, especially the EU. I mean, he's basically their equivalent of Queen Elizabeth II over in Germany at this point. I mean, it really is. I think that's one of the best sort of virtues of Baudrillard's thinking in this matter. But when it comes to, for example, or to give another example as well, in Britain, you can't say that resisting these genocidal bastards is good, and you can't. Well, you can, but if you say exactly who's doing it, well, I'm not going. If the door breaks down, you'll know where I've gone. If I say that Hezbollah and Hamas are fighting genocidal bastards, then oh shit, they're here. But you get a sense of you can't even name the resistance to evil now, and in that sense, this diffuseness, this omnipresence of power, this preemptive fear, which doesn't require the same structure as, say, feudal or disciplinary forms. This is really what structures this divide between hegemony and domination, which in ways does map onto the distinction that Deleuze posits between discipline and control. And I wonder if we could get into just asking sort of everyone here sort of what we think about this idea that we've moved away from a paradigm of domination, which is based on, master and slave relationships. It's very muscular. It wants to defend a set of positive values. It's kind of crowned and conquering, as opposed to this model of hegemony, which is, as Baudrillard says, cybernetic. It uses systems rather than strong, central or internal and indeed personal masters and nodes. Its semiotics are all over the place. It dissolves and uses any signs it can get a hold of to maintain itself, and is ultimately quite cynical and even very ironic about its own existence. I mean, do we think this shift is really accurate as he's describing it, or are we still, in many ways, still under this a more traditional form of domination?
I think the difficulty is, and I try to put this in parentheses, is, I mean, obviously there's still forms of domination persisting, but I think I spoke about it probably not as well as I could now, 6 months later. But back in May, I wrote something as it was. This isn't the exact topic, but a good lead into it. There's just so many different groups that want to go back to domination, I guess, because it gives them kind of a symbolic power either to resist against or to be on top of. I guess the best way I find this is honestly in figures like Elon Musk, which I know is a little bit of different direction, but I honestly think there's a bunch of capitalists that genuinely hate capitalism because capitalism kind of trends towards this hegemonic view of nobody gets in the way of the system as a whole, not even the people who are currently benefiting from it, which is the domination mode, where you can really tell on the other end, people like Musk, maybe even Bezos. I don't know enough billionaires off the top of my head. I did use the space for other things, but they really want a system that perpetually puts them back in power. They don't want to have to worry that the wrong bit of gambling on the stock market could lose them 90% of their wealth at any given moment. But the system as a whole, hegemony, doesn't really care about that. As long as the system keeps going, they're perfectly fine with anybody failing with that. And part of that is the reason I think it's so hard to kind of tell if we've entered into just pure hegemony, because there's just so many groups, whether it's the far right turn within, I guess, more mass politics, or it's kind of the more far right turn and they kind of elite politics. There are still people who clamor one way or another for domination to return or to bring it back. But ultimately, I think the problem is that hegemonic power can persist through these systems. It kind of sees them as just little bumps in the road. As far as I've studied fascism, it's kind of a system that just collapses upon itself and is almost used as an example. It's like, isn't liberal capitalism better than this thing? Which obviously it is to anyone's mind. It's why I voted in this election, as it is a little bit better, but it's also makes us forget that better things are possible. I feel like I'm a little bit rambling right now, but
this is the cathartic ramble episode. We're only 48 hours out of this election, but Adam, I'm sorry.
Well, no, I think Musk is a great example of it to highlight the distinction between hegemony and domination, partially because in a way, Twitter is a control system. All social media platforms are control systems. They algorithmically learn. It's not as if you're forced to like someone's post. It's just, likes are generally shared and diffuse, and it's horizontally flat. But the infrastructure, the platform itself, you can't actually change. The system perpetuates itself through ad revenue. And I think what's interesting with people like Musk and Trump and that generation of essentially terminally online billionaires is they want to be liked, and they want to be recognized for how special and lovely and successful and smart they are. And usually you could in before, these platforms were all more or less on the same playing field to some extent, which is why Musk can embarrass himself online, and he doesn't like the fact that no one likes him. In a domination mode, going back to some sort of feudal lord sense, you have to be deferent to your betters. People will typically be deferential to billionaires and journalists and people in these higher institutions, so to speak, before social media. Now we can tweet at anyone who's on Twitter who may be far richer than us and far more powerful than us, and we can tell them to kill themselves if we so fancy. That is rare. That is rare. Look, I'm not being trite. This is the first time in human history you could ever do that and not be tracked down, locked in prison forever, or murdered by the state. That is a rare opportunity. Before, as Will would point out with Mr. Foucault, the jester was the only person allowed to laugh at the king. Now we can laugh at the kings all the time, and in doing so undermine the spectacle that they are kings are actually as better than us as capitalist meritocracy would have you have it. And what is the ideology that all of these terminally online billionaires naturally gravitate to? People like Musk, Thiel, Largely Srinivasan, fucking Curtis Yarvin, who's not a billionaire, but he sucks up to them enough. Nick Lands, they all gravitate towards the same neo-monarchist ideology. And that includes integralism, because in that case, the Pope is the king, or whoever they would like to be the Pope. They gravitate towards this because they do want to reimpose domination, because the flatness of our platform systems of communication, and particularly the ones in the capitalist West, Aaron Bushnell is revered with a far greater, more regular attendance at people holding his image aloft in Yemen on marches with millions of people. But here it is so diffuse. And I think, in a way, the return to domination is to try and reimpose a hierarchy on the flatness of a distributed platform system, which already has a hierarchy, but they themselves will not recognize it, because they don't just want power to say, Elon Musk could ban everyone who told him that he was a twat online if he'd like, but he wants to be liked by us. And so, in a way, to try and change the consciousness rather than just delimit it in advance is really the model, I think, of this fascist yearning for autocracy and indeed monarchy.
Let me just say one thing before we move on, because I have a note here that won't make sense anywhere else in the discussion, which is when we look at Elon Musk in particular and interventions that he's made to manipulate the timeline, the univocity of posts is what really troubles him. So, of course, he has to throttle certain accounts, accelerate others. Ultimately, really what it is, it's a referendum on the murder of the real, or the loss of the symbolic order, or the imagined transmogrification of the transcendental conditions of the symbolic order. I think this is kind of what we're fighting against. That's basically just another way to say what Adam said.
I want to return it sort of to this question of life and death. And I just want to say that, in reference to what occurred 2 days ago, there's really nothing that can be said about Donald Trump that he isn't already completely absorbed in. There isn't something that can be said, that isn't already part of the caricature that he participates in. Of course, this version of him is different. It's personalized. It's just a set of beliefs about particular people. But all of that is a distraction from something that I think is far more fundamental and profound, which is that really the arrival of this period in American politics can be understood as, I think, nothing further than sort of the complete domination of biopolitical modernity and the commodity. I think that really the only way to understand this is the emptiness of Donald Trump is sort of the emptiness of the American conception of the commodity. And it's a politics of essentially purchasing representation. Like, I really don't see Donald Trump as anything other than a kind of refinement of the emptiness of politics in the bourgeois parliamentary era. Like, this has been coming since the First World War. I mean, the only way Americans conceive of life is through the mediation of the commodity and the mediation of their own exchange value. And the only way that that's possible is through the mass mobilization of a biopolitics that can render human beings as something that can be evaluated along those lines. And this idea that Donald Trump is a return to domination, I think, is ultimately a half correct one, but it's a return of a kind of sovereignty that exists only in reference to a kind of biological protection. It's not a sovereignty where one has the right to kill. It's a kind of sovereignty around the anxiety of life. It's not a return of death. It's an emboldening of the biological threats that exist to human beings. I mean, think about the way in which gay and trans folks were depicted by right-wing movements as a degradation of the species, of the sexuality of the species. Think of the way Donald Trump spoke about immigrants. They are a stain on the genetics of the people. They're destroying the blood of the nation. This kind of anxiety is one that exists around life. The way in which we're supposed to believe that it's a trade when 90 people are killed in northern Gaza because Israel spotted one spotter, and this is supposed to be understood as an existential threat. We're not supposed to buy that. We're not supposed to say, yes, well, there's going to be collateral damage in any war. No, we're just supposed to consign ourselves to an understanding that this is what governance is, that we are always held out to death and always totally mobilized. This is a return of a cruder biopolitics. That's really the only way that I can see this. This is not some sort of deep catastrophe that is only now starting with the election of Donald Trump. This catastrophe is ongoing, and Donald Trump's re-election return in this sort of politically mutated state is only an indication of this further refinement. And I don't think that there is a policy solution to this. I really don't think that fascism was just one of the several options on a ballot. This is a very particular kind of politics that's only possible with our perpetual participation. And I think that the question of can we still die, it's a mutation of what it means to die and how we've captured death and how death is used. It's a question of who gets to die. And I think that's what's often lost.
I guess to continue that, part of what I was most disappointed in the agony of power is kind of the discussion that isn't kind of furthered on what's kind of on the back page here, which is just cut off from, page bottom 47, top of 48, is kind of this Baudrillard being willing to step beyond what power is. I'm trying my best to kind of continue from what Will was saying in that this analysis of domination and hegemony, I want to see what happens when we can actually imagine of a world without power. And he discusses this to some point. I'm kind of disappointed it was really only like a paragraph, maybe a paragraph and a half at most, of this world where we don't need politics to decide whether life and death actually means anything. Kind of I guess to me, the closest thing I can imagine of a world without power, whether that's domination or hegemony, is a world where we don't actually need the symbolic order to exist for us in a way. I guess trying to put that in easier terms, or like at least different terms, it's kind of hard for me to actually scale my thoughts right at the moment, because all of this stuff does make me as angry, at least up here, as kind of will really shows through the body or through its talking. And it is really does piss me off that just so many people are at the kind of behest of this global power that no longer cares for them. And I tried to bring in Levinas back when I was writing my undergraduate thesis, because I wanted to figure out a way, partly to understand how I ended up caring about these people and how that could end up being a mass movement. And I know this is another kind of rant off to the side, but every single time I've investigated that, I'm like, this is just actually demolishing power is just way too personal of a thing to do, I guess. It has to be done at a personal level where someone is willing to, or maybe not willing to, but experiences life at such an overwhelming way that they can no longer continue their apathy towards other groups. They can no longer just see the rubble on top of children or the crimes that the IDF publishes about themselves over and over and over again and think these lives don't matter because I have to go to work on Monday. And there's just so much about hegemony that just makes us want to think about ourselves in a way that I really do hate. And I hope I properly responded to Will. Not quite sure if I have, but that's just kind of what it got me thinking of. It's like, we need a way to create a politics where you learn to care about other people and actually destroys the power that keeps us from doing so.
I think that one way that exemplifies the fundamental element of participation in all of this is that one of the parties that sort of failed in trying to prevent Donald Trump from seizing the presidency is now taking a look at population demographics, right? And trying to isolate particular people who can be subject to blame, especially the sort of racialized depiction of this, right? Donald Trump won 5% more here with this group. And I think that there's this reactive desire to find a sort of constituent kernel in the sort of failure of the American populace and say, aha, there's this sort of degradation of the population that made possible the arrival of Trump, and not the fact that this very mode of thinking about the electorate is precisely what produces Trumpism. And I think that so long as we're trapped in this cycle of political representation, I think at the end of the day, the transformation of life and the transformation of death remains kind of in this state of absolute deployment where we are always at biological risk and so on. So I think that Donald Trump's rhetoric is certainly a kind of return to sovereignty. I think he'll find it again extremely difficult. But there's, I think, a case to be made that this was going to be the result. This kind of politics was going to be the result, even if, say, the Democratic candidate won. This was still the developmental track.
One of the things that really bothers me about this book, I just think many of the claims are just false. They're empirically false. One of them is the idea that capital has been, at least at the time that Baudrillard wrote this, that it was able to somehow surpass itself. And part of it could be that Baudrillard simply didn't have the benefit of experiencing the financial collapse of 2008 and seeing that late capitalism, or whatever it is that we want to call it, capitalist realism, it did expose its clay feet. But of course, the riposte to that is the left did not make good on that opening. But I don't think that's what Baudrillard is saying here. I think what he's saying is that there's a sort of claddenness to capitalism at this point in history that does make it impenetrable, or that it's transformed itself in such a way as to go beyond itself. And it made me think, like, okay, if we're picking out frameworks within the milieu and space of thinkers that we work with, who is saying it best? There is an immaterial dimension to capital, as we know. And could it be the case that through the machinations of late capitalism and the apparatuses which buttress it, how do we make an account of how domination does flip to hegemony which might be another way to say, how does the material, sort of concrete on the skin aspect of capitalism then transform into this more spectral form of control? When I think about Deleuze and Guattari's analysis in Anti-Oedipus, for example, I wonder if, to a certain extent, that what we understand as hegemony isn't just a deeper, more robust, enriched articulation of what they call a miraculating machine. Maybe the challenge with Anti-Oedipus is it's not merely that the illusion or conceit of capital is being reproduced at every level of production, that every level of life that has been subjugated by capital is somehow being brought under the notion that capital is required to reproduce our reality or to create flourishing for any form of life. In some sense, capital, in some senses, literally is under the skin, but it's created this battery of habits and gestures that still allow it and attempt to become continuous, if not, completely synchronous with the movement of all life on the planet in some way. There's a way of imagining this too, where I think what capital is trying to do, and like even what like Elon is trying to do with Twitter as this massive commodity, is that capital is forced to merge everything that it obsolesces with this evolution of planetary collapse. And that's the way it sort of cannibalizes elements within its sphere and undergoes what we call anti-production, the creation of a body without organs. One of the claims that I think is false on its face in this book, that this is a virtual catastrophe, the catastrophe of total exchange that is not even protected by money or the market. I mean, I think it's a false claim overall, but I think the spirit of it is right. But I think the scope of Baudrillard's observation is ill-placed. One of the things that we're experiencing now under capital, especially those of us who work like in podcasting and stuff like that, is that nobody owns anything anymore. And Adam said it on the show before. But capital is forced to anti-produce at some level to create a new body without organs. And so one of the ways that it has done that is that it's fractalized into the new form of the platform, and which essentially merges the attention economy with like the rentier subscription model. And so that's just one example since Baudrillard, how capital has rearticulated itself. But what has it done? It's brought into its thrall a set of users, a set of accounts, a set of individualities that are then, for lack of a better term, educated or inscribed with new habits and gestures that kind of keep piloting along. And I think at the level of resistance, ultimately, something's got to give. We have to stop. We have to refuse at some point. Maybe it means capital driving itself close to the precipice yet again, and that our practices of refusal somehow manifest then into, basically, it meets up with an event, that the body of practices of refusal, gestures of refusal, will sidle up to this event where capital and sovereign power as we know it edges up against some sort of precipice, and it's then action can be taken at the collective level. But it's something that needs to be practiced. There is no pedagogy without actual movement. But that was a huge riff just to interrogate whether Deleuze and Guattari are a better model than Baudrillard for analyzing this. But since you work with Deleuze and Guattari, I wonder what you think about that.
My answer is a clear yes. I do like Deleuze and Guattari almost better than any other thinker. So I am biased. I'm not exactly the person to go to if you want a fair opinion. But before I respond kind of to the rest of that riff, you did remind me early on, once I got this book, I asked Taylor Adkins what he thought about it. And I was messaging him, and he's like, I don't really ever get a feel of whether or not I can trust Baudrillard that much. Not necessarily on the empirical claim stuff, but kind of just on his politics in general, I think is what Taylor meant by that. Or I guess philosophy in general. It's a little bit too pessimistic for me personally. That Deleuze and Guattari definitely weren't. You kind of see all those pictures of them out and protesting with Foucault and Sartre and stuff like that. Even if their philosophy is informed by people like Wilhelm Reich, which were almost pretty much Reich at least in certain books like Listen, Little Man, are not very big fans of democracy and how it treats fascism, which I find that book a little bit funny because it is just a long rant of, oh my God, you guys are so stupid. why do you keep doing this for about 100 pages? But to try and respond to the rest of that, how capitalism has changed, I guess how Adam's been discussed in the past, or what you said Adam has been discussing in the past. I do think at least Baudrillard's kind of theory of the virtual has some importance to it here, especially how it goes with history and how this is going to be very important going to a Trump second administration, and how we're going to talk about prices and stuff like that, because there's going to be a lot of Republicans who probably will just act like everything is fine now, even though the prices are the same, if not more. But in combating power, I think a lot of the problem I've seen, at least on the economics of power, or how power relates to actual economics and finance lately for the average person, it's been shifting to a subscription/rent economy for a long time now. And it's really accelerated in my lifetime, especially in the last decade. Almost everything has a subscription to it. Occasionally I've thought of jokes of everybody has a Patreon so they can afford to subscribe to everyone else's Patreon, but on a larger, broader scale. And we're going to continue seeing that, because that means that if you don't own anything, you continually have to put in the money you make into capital flows of particular businesses so they can stay afloat, rather than just selling you one really good crock pot and you don't need one for the next 40 years. And then the company goes under, obviously. But the problem you find in the average politics is people keep debating over the fact that rent costs more now than the fact that we shouldn't have to sell our lives so that we can have housing or food and stuff like that. There's never really a discussion for most people about that the system as a whole has a problem, rather than, for most people, it's just, oh, the evil system was slightly better a few years ago.
No, absolutely. The shift in, I mean, I do see this as somewhat symbolic as well, given the sort of the commodity par excellence of the MAGA movement is a subscription service for pillows, which people don't typically buy a lot of. Or even going into stuff like, I mean, let's go, it is known now that because the amount of Uber drivers don't necessarily own the cars that they use. A lot of delivery drivers who use bikes use e-bikes that are rented. There's less and less space. Commodities are shrinking. Even, I would say even the dogs are shrinking as the trendier dogs get smaller and smaller in my area. If there was a Great Dane trend, no landlord would allow it. But to that extent, I think the virtual is definitely important, and Baudrillard's definitely hitting something correct there. But I wonder if it's also just, in a way, not necessarily as new as he's highlighting it, in the sense of one of the ways that capital works. I'm drawing here on the work of Mao, not Chairman Soren Mao. He talked about sort of one of these great ways of theorizing the sort of impersonal aspect of capitalist domination, or what Baudrillard would call hegemony, which is also similar to how Deleuze and Guattari talk about it. Is in a way it's transcendental, in the sense of, the transcendental concerns the conditions of possibility for something coming into existence, or something being actual. And what capital does is it takes conditions of possibility of you reproducing your life, food, shelter, sociality, and then it inserts itself in between you, the transcendental conditions of possibility and their actuality, such that you don't own the means of actualizing your own social reproduction. And I think to that extent, the virtual as the transcendental, as that which prevents actualities from coming into being, is absolutely more intensifying in this particularly rentier landlord economy. I mean, that line that no one owns anything, it's not mine. The first time I remember hearing it, and this goes all the way back to your central question, Cameron, about death. It was someone being interviewed during the George Floyd riots. And this woman said, the newscaster was using the typical question, why are you burning your own community? And then before he could even get the sentence finished, he says, because we don't own anything. Like, this ain't our community. We don't own shit around here. And in terms of death, I think this kind of, I was trying to theorize it to some extent in Anti-Oculus by talking about the cybernetics of how many, was there a certain level of death at which the system tips over into active revolt and they can't recuperate it anymore? I have to admit, relying too much on the cybernetics in that one chapter. This is why the rest of the book is anti-cybernetic, and thank God for it. I think to that extent, partially, I think that thesis has been dampened significantly, because in our lifetimes, in this decade, and indeed during the last Trump administration, there were deaths that were named deaths. Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and cops burned. Cities burned. Police stations were on fire all across the states. In the UK, there were street confrontations with police. There were statues thrown in rivers. The statue of Edward Colston in Bristol, for example. And those deaths energized a transcontinental movement of refusal in a way in which I'm not sure if we're going to see this through the purely numerical saturation with these murders that we're seeing from the genocide in Palestine. And I think that is definitely partly due in a way to the cybernetics that Baudrillard is talking about. Capital, that the empire essentially inserts itself between our ability to see it and our ability to change it. But I wonder if it's changed so far, insofar as Baudrillard does over-egg the cybernetic aspect of it, whereas Deleuze and Guattari will say these machines work by breaking down, just a matter of finding out how to break them. I'm not sure. It feels like death hasn't led to, it doesn't have the same symbolic efficacy. And even going back to the civil rights movement one of the big responses to my work on death and social riots was from Billy Cashborn. She mentioned Mamie Till, Emmett Till's open casket. The use of death. How do we use death to construct those narratives that fuel resistance? Even the same going on to revolutionary suicides as a concept. The line from Bushnell all the way back to Huey B. Newton.
One of the challenges to addressing seizing back the meaning of death. And here's a place in the text where I think Baudrillard is on point, but I think it needs to be qualified. He doesn't flesh it out as such, but it's when he's talking about the democratic illusion of imagination or intelligence. And as somebody who counts themselves as a philosopher, a theorist of the imagination, I felt like I was being taken aim at here. But then after you read the passage, I really understood like what it is he was trying to say and how it applies today, which is, he says, we should abandon the democratic illusion of imagination or intelligence in power that comes from the depths of Enlightenment ideology. The naive utopias of the 1960s must be revised. And then in quotes, imagination and power, take your dreams for reality, no limits to pleasure. All of these slogans were realized or hyper-realized in the development of this system that we live in. And I tried to kind of think against Baudrillard here and read against the grain a bit. And it made me realize, I think for everyone who's in this particular session right now, and most of the people that we're friends and comrades with, I think we don't think this way. I think the way that we live in the world is very tentative with respect to those kinds of statements. Imagination and power. Take all your dreams for reality. No limits to pleasure. I don't think that kind of libertinism characterizes today's left. In fact, I think these lines here are the very things that are parroted by the likes of Elon Musk and such, who wants to sell us on cool car optimism at the end of the day. And this is, once again, that referendum on the symbolic order. And I'm going to tie this back into Deleuze and Guattari in a second, which is there are people who are sold on the idea of cool car optimism, right? Which is the Cybertruck, right? But there's also on the other side, there's a disdain for the Cybertruck that I think that reflects the banality of that optimism. I think one of the things that, and this takes us back to our central question is, how do we reclaim the symbolic order? How do we reclaim death from the grip of hegemony? I think ultimately this reflects this hyper-Promethean attitude that they're basically, they got the paddles on it and they're giving it a jolt every day to make it happen. Like Serene Richards has said in previous interviews that we had with her, there's a lot of energy dumped into getting us to imagine the world in a certain way. And I mean, that's certainly the case for the kind of digital egregore that Trump, Elon, and RFK are trying to make. There's this notion of freedom that is this kind of shambling remnant of the Enlightenment. But the problem is that we may not get the symbolic order back in the way that we imagine we can, or in the way that we imagine that it was. And I think perhaps our best bet is to realize, and this goes hand in hand with the accelerationist fragment and anti-Oedipus, in my opinion, is that the one thing that has not been realized, this is my refrain throughout this entire podcast over the past 4 years, which is we have not taken the nomad subjectivity to its ultimate limit yet, that we on the ground must mobilize in a way and realize the deterritorializing capacity of capital, the way that it decodes flows, and that we have been subject to that. That is the way that we are going to create the conditions for the possibility of a new kind of thriving. And even in the wake of the election, like when you're looking online, amongst those of us who count ourselves as radical, and I'll even lump some left liberals in there too, people knew that the centrist liberalism of Kamala Harris and Biden, it wasn't going to fly. And of course, we hate to see Trumpism come back. But I think what's more telling is the kind of residue that we leave behind in the ensuing hours of the Harris lost Trump victory, which is that we do have this sort of lingering shred of hope for this Enlightenment philosophy, that we are so completely inured to this Promethean dream that we're trapped in, that unless we get out of that, there is no change. And so something has to happen at the level of imagination. I think it's not imagination in power, maybe unless it's a destituent form of power. But there is a necessity, I think, and Baudrillard, this is me just riffing off of Baudrillard here, that we must disarticulate imagination in power somehow for that to be realized. And that is a kind of, I don't know if we want to call it a kind of accelerationism, but it is a desubjectivation. It is a kind of nomadism that I don't think the left, broadly construed, has realized for itself in the 20th and 21st century.
This is the kind of optimism that you find in texts like The Coming Community by Giorgio Agamben, right? This is the kind of optimism that you find in parts of Foucault's corpus towards the end of his life. The space of desubjectivation allows for a kind of moment to seize the processes of resubjectivation and to either refuse them or to play with them. One of the problems with Baudrillard is that he leans extraordinarily into the impersonalization of processes of capital to the point where he finds himself over on the side of an object. He finds himself over on the old opposition between subject and object, and he says the subject is immaterial now to political philosophy. This is the kind of perfect metaphysical nihilism that we see in thinkers as broad as Bruno Latour in the later works of Karl Marx. I think that in a certain way, like, it remains insufficient because it fails to see that there's a deeply personal element to the participation in the subjectivation that is the polling booth, that is like I've got student grading that I need to do. That's at one level the impersonal, right? That I've got 30 or so students that are who are nothing but student ID numbers and GPAs that get shot through all the way to my instructor evaluation, et cetera, et cetera. But on the other hand, I could really mess up their life if I give them a 1 out of 10 on an essay tonight. It's only from the proximity to academic power that, we live in a time of complete impersonality, and we live in a time of the massification of life, and what we need to do is understand this and mobilize on that basis. No, there are two levels to this. The reality is that desubjectivation and resubjectivation occur always at the same time. And to lean over on the side of the object and say, this is where the entire is to just refortify and reify the Cartesian subject as the operator of politics. So you've got these two things where on the one hand, you've got a network of relations and the nihilism of the metaphysics of the commodity. And then on the other, you've got what's left of modernist politics that has done nothing but produce the violence of the exclusion of disabled people, of Black people, of trans people. I mean, I could list the ways in which forms of life are constituted and excluded from our politics over on the side of modernity, and then precisely how all of this is reconstituted on the side of political objectivity. So no, like the nihilism of Baudrillard is nothing new. Baudrillard is, I think, ultimately a reactionary with a very important position in the history of political philosophy, and that's why we have to read him. But it's the same reason why we have to read people like Carl Schmitt, who talk about the depoliticization of modernity. There's not a far distance between these two thinkers. And one of them collapsed into fascism and the other collapsed into a meaningless kind of post-Marxian nihilism. And, I don't see a politics possible from this that doesn't start at the level of ethics, that doesn't start at saying, okay, how do we live our life? We have to change the way we individually live our lives, and saying, well, no, that's wishy-washy, hippy-dippy, liberal platitudes. Okay, put forward a party. Put forward a party. I want to see the party. Where is it? Where is it? I'm so sick of Marxists looking at moments that break from the perpetual present, and they say, oh, the reason it failed was that there weren't enough Leninists there. Are you fucking kidding me? For me, in a certain sense, Baudrillard is the marker of a particular symptom of modern philosophy. And the disposition he has in the relationship to death tells us that, in fact, we have not sufficiently understood the way in which sovereignty has actually captured death through biopolitics. Foucault left it out there and didn't articulate it. He didn't want to, I guess, but we've failed to capture it. I think Deleuze doesn't quite capture it. I think Foucault doesn't quite capture it. I think Baudrillard obviously doesn't quite capture it. We have to understand the way in which death is deployed, because it'll tell us about the subject and its position.
I just imagine myself like on Tuesday at 5:30 in the morning when this goes out, just cleaning up the YouTube comments after that rant. So, but this actually brings us, maybe this will be the last big topic before we close it out. I think the provocation that Will puts forward then is, it takes us back right to the beginning of our talk is, what does the reclamation of meaning look like? Is the symbolic order as we understand it, in the sense that it's capable of producing for us the kinds of meanings, or can we access the transcendental conditions of the symbolic order in such a way to manifest the kind of world that we want, that would make life meaningful, that would make death meaningful, that would... I'll give my piece first, and then everyone else can close it out. I think one of the challenges to the question that you asked, Cam, it made me think that I wanted to reframe it. And this attends to, I guess, my reading of Deleuze and folks like James Hillman is that I don't think in the last instance, people on a daily basis, all kinds of people in general, are looking for a quote unquote meaningful life. I don't think so. I think what people want is they want to be transformed. They want to feel. They want to have a sensate connection with the world. Not to say that they don't want meaning, but I don't think that's first. I also have a new thesis is like, I think we want to be well with the prospect of boredom, with long tracts of time filled with nothing. And to exist in that space, for that to be its own kind of flourishing in some way, to be attentive to small details. Those are things that I think would make life richer. And maybe that includes, adding meaning to our lives. But I think by focusing on meaning, we run the risk of setting that aside or putting it in the background. I don't know, Cam, maybe you can make a defense of your claim, or just maybe you have a response to that.
I guess you've kind of gotten to what I was going to speak about with this topic. Particularly, I think this is kind of the last section of the essay I wrote, which is basically just 2 paragraphs. But for me, meaning is very, very dangerous. That's something that's pretty wild if you went up to someone random on the street that's not really a philosophy person and said that, they'd be like, what the hell do you mean by that? Like, stop talking to me. But for me, kind of trying to go back to a world of meaning, or the symbolic order where things meant things like they used to at the very least, is a very, very dangerous game to play at all, basically. And that's not to say it's like a politically hopeless move, I guess, but meaning really is one of the tools that can be played against us the easiest. It's not really that far divorced from the fact that death now either means nothing or everything. It's just kind of a further division of the problematics of, I guess, the politics of meaning, and how it can be, if we go back to a system where death does mean something, we still have the possibility that meaning is manipulated by power structures and stuff like that. For me, the way forward, in some degree on how you described it, is almost a pure step beyond the symbolic order into the real. There's no need to have language or just like kind of plain old moralistic values. To answer Will's last point, I do see ethics as something further than just kind of moral values like Kant might want to see it. I think it's something felt very deeply at the level of kind of desire and stuff like that. It should make your just kind of stomach turn to see the images of the brutality going on in Gaza. It doesn't need to go through, I guess, meaning for it to have, I guess the closest word I have is value to you, to affect you, to change you and transform you. I guess as long as the best answer I have, obviously I'm only in my early mid-20s and may not have all the best answers ever, but the answer I have for where we should go is to see if there's a path additionally without meaning, but also additionally without the possibility for capture, that systems that want to make us apathetic or even hateful, as a lot of, at least the MAGA true believers, as I like to call them, pretty much a lot of them are at their base. They're just suffering, and I want everyone else to suffer. That's just not a worldview I want to run the risk at falling into. I want to care deeply without kind of the need for a symbolic order to, I guess, transmit that through. It shouldn't be manipulatable. I don't know if that's necessarily a possible politics, but it's the closest I have.
I mean, I'll just say maybe one thing in response to that before going to Adam is, I feel an incredible accretion of grief from seeing all the images that I've seen over the past year. And I've regrettably, in some ways, don't have a way to process it. I mean, I talk about it with my wife. I mean, there's times where I feel like I want to cry and I don't. And I feel like I don't have the, it's almost as if I don't have the facility to do it, or the kind of setup to do it. Life on a laptop is very solipsistic in one way. And, the incessant stream of social media and seeing these things, and like I said, the univocity of posts and images, it does something to you at an ethical level. It's not something that, as you said, that has an immediate sort of moralistic value pegged to it. But what it does is it elicits this kind of feeling that demands of us to make an ethical account of what is happening.
The meaning of life is only the second hardest question to the meaning of death, because one is far more easily distributed. I mean, I have to admit, I think, well, you're right, that a lot of the philosophers that we sort of focus on this channel are quite bad at focusing on it. I mean, in terms of the diffuseness and the institutionalization of death, you got to, before you go to Baudrillard, you got to turn to someone like Orlando Patterson, slavery and social death. That's the kind of person I turn to try and inject something into, like the Bataille's version of death, the wasting and the people marked to be exterminated or wasted, quite literally, by the economic system that governs the entire planet. I mean, part of me wonders if there's sort of a hidden third term here, and I'm not being Derridian too much about it, which is the afterlife, which is kind of like the unity of life and death that kind of mediates our relations to the two. Not necessarily in the sense of literal afterlife, but a sense of, that thing that Craig is talking about, to the transformation, which is the idea, which is when we think about self-abolition in the individual sense, that is, the classic Camus, Kierkegaard aspect of suicide. I mean, But when we talk about collective self-abolition, we talk about, the proletarian or the subaltern collectively abolishing its position as oppressed. And to that extent, that is an afterlife in a way, in the sense, this is kind of the point of revolutionary suicide, to the extent of the afterlife is the continuation of this in the movement around it. This is to restore a meaning to a life and the death. It have to be an afterlife to transformation, rather than being the transformation being, I cannot exist in the way I currently exist, which for most people in the West is, if you're lucky enough to be honest, is just a life of omnipresent consumption. Most of our job, if you have an email job, your job is to spend money primarily, because the most of it, as Bojo would actually point out, and he's correct about this, it's just about keeping it circulating. Those frictions or fictions, are the things that really capitalism is extracting the most from it, and maybe a concept of the afterlife or the after transformation. The collective building of it is the process itself, and to that extent, a meaning of death here. It's. I do think of the most common refrain in Generation Z or sort of late millennial humor, or being around self-abolition, if you get what I mean. The KYS joke as almost becomes a refrain upon which we consolidate our subjectivity in the face of a world which we hate, and is regularly tells us that it hates us, and we're not even the primary targets of it. To that extent, it might have something or an afterlife of communism, or an afterlife of political activity, because then there is kind of a, rather than the undeath of constantly trudging on to the patterns of addiction that capital sort of modulates us into, there would probably be an undeath so much as a somewhat of a rebirth of radicality, not in sort of this flash of an instant. You're not talking about St. Paul having a flash of light and then being reborn and seeing like this future and going, oh shit, I've got to do that. I do think it ends up being the quest for the change, the meaning of death. It has to go beyond solidarity as a mode of consuming sad content and really to an active version of struggle. I keep thinking about this line from Black Marxism, a line I think about far too often, well, not too often, which is he's talking about, so Cedric Robinson's talking about the Haitian Revolution. He's talking about one of the fights, and he says, by the end of the battle, they were doubly blessed. Not only had they won, but their dead were free. And that sounds kind of trite, that Horkheimer responds to Benjamin by saying, Benjamin says, the enemy will not, the dead will not be safe from the enemy if he wins, and the enemy has not ceased to win. Horkheimer says, the dead is truly dead. There's an aspect of finitude there, absolutely. But I wonder if something has to dive in ourselves before we can actually bring death back to the beast that led us to death in the first place. I don't know. Real happy episode, this one, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that the question of are we still able to die, it's a question of whether or not our death is considered one. When one of the problems of works like The Agony of Power, but also Judith Butler's work on grievable life, is that it presupposes a Western disposition on the conception of death and grievability, and then it tries to go over and say that grievable life is, of course, worthwhile life. But rather than starting at that point, we fail to really start at the point of like, not what's grievable life, but like what do we even consider qualified life? Like what even starts at our point of politics? Forget death. Who's living? The liberal philosopher John Locke, the life of the slave is the life of someone who is the walking dead. They've ceded their status as qualified life. And I think that the question now needs to be, okay, sure, we're all statistics or whatever the Nietzschean disposition is. But the question is, okay, we are all bare life, but now whose death is considered necessary for biological salvation? And of course, it's always the trans person, the immigrant, the Palestinian. These are the folks who are considered biological threats. And we have to, in order to seize life and death, we have to refuse the way in which it's presented to us. And I think that the game of representing life and representing death is one that needs to stop first. And before we escape that, we'll never escape this sort of strange, macabre reality that we've entered into.
Cam, what's next for you? Do you have any writing coming along? Are you going to grad school? What's happening?
I'm hoping I'm going to grad school. I have one I deferred, and I'm trying to reapply with, especially after thinking for months, I'm actually have a much more grounded project that kind of begins with this article of kind of understanding power as reality, and kind of to tie together politics and metaphysics in at least a different way than Derrida did. Because I know he talks about that, even though I haven't really started of grammatology yet, but that's a separate thing. For me right now, I'm on a kind of a weird bent after getting through David Graeber's Debt. On the advent of capitalism is incredibly interesting to me for some unknown reason. Like a how we got here kind of story, I guess, is probably what a lot of my next few writings are going to be. But going back and thinking about these ideas of, I guess, life and death at the heart of politics probably will kind of get a little bit more focus. I do hope so, especially because, I guess, following you guys, and especially Will, because biopolitics is so important to you, I've come to understand at the heart of my philosophy and the heart of my politics that there is a kind of ableism at the root of power, and how it, I guess, dispenses its oppression or physical repression against everybody, no matter the group, and kind of hoping to get closer to how we allow that to happen is one of the things I want to understand. And the second thing is, how do we get actually beyond that? How do we get it to where you can no longer politically or philosophically or even physically disable somebody? Because that's the heart, whether it's racial oppression, gender oppression, expression oppression, whether like in terms of sexuality and gender nonconformity and stuff like that. How do we actually get to a kind of world without power? Is, I think, a lot of where I want to go. As this exposes me kind of as Twitter brained a lot, but to reference Will's tweet, generally, I think now I'm starting to prefer anarchy in a way. Not necessarily as the way a lot of anarchists think about it, but honestly, after reading Deleuze and years of seeing actually what's going on in politics and being awoken by how the world system works, I have no other philosophical response than to say that this is unacceptable. Something fundamental can no longer exist.